Well, welcome everyone. It's lovely to have everyone back after what I hope was a wonderful summer. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all sit, and in my case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge their relationship with land and country, their knowledge systems and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders in the group today. So my name's Liz Pye, and once again, I'm your host for this webinar. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. We're recording this event to share with friends who are unable to make it today. So if you want to be sure you won't appear, please turn your camera off now. I'd also like to recognise the contribution made by all friends of the library. Your support enables us to run programs like this and to deliver on the library's purpose. So thank you. Today is something of a treat, I think. You'll hear from two of our digital access librarians. So those of you who came to our last lunch will be familiar with Andrew McConville and David Flegg. So as well as being passionate footy fans, they're also passionate about the library and will give you an insight into the lives of two of the characters linked to the library's history. So each of them will speak for 10 to 15 minutes and we'll have questions at the end after both presentations are complete. So please submit your questions via the chat throughout the presentations though, and I'll sort of bring them together and ask them at the end. So you can either submit them to everyone, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, send them through to me, Liz Pye, personally. Is there anyone who needs assistance locating the chat function? If not, let's begin our presentations. And we're going to hear from Andrew first. So over to you, Andrew.
Oops, sorry, phone just rang at the wrong time. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And as Liz said, we're going to talk about a couple of very different characters from our library's history. And I'm going to talk about Dr. Thomas Bride, who is our third Chief Librarian. And I'll just bring up a slide that shows sort of the bare bones of his life. So you see there that he qualified as a Doctor of Laws from Melbourne University. He was a very brilliant student, but he didn't really pursue the law as his first career. He became a librarian at Melbourne University, and then he became our Chief Librarian in 1881. And finally, the final part of his career was as the Curator of Estates of Deceased Persons. So there he was using his legal training. But he was born in County Cork, and he emigrated with his family in 1858, which was a particularly interesting time in Melbourne's history. The gold rush was in full swing, as was a massive amount of migration to the colony of Victoria and to the city of Melbourne. And that was driven partly by the lure of gold and by the hope of a better life, and certainly by fairly desperate circumstances in people's home countries. And that was particularly the case with Irish immigrants. But the Bride family were more affluent than most, in fact. They came out as unassisted migrants. They came out on this beautiful ship, the Young America, which was a state-of-the-art ship at the time. And Thomas's father was actually qualified. And when he got to Melbourne, he was able to get a job as the surveyor with what was then the borough of Hawthorn. And this is the Melbourne that they would have seen when they arrived. And just to get your bearings, that's the original Princess Bridge. So where Swanston Street meets St Kilda Road. And already Melbourne is taking on a fairly grand aspect. And I think that looks a lot different than it would have in about 1850. And this is the library that Thomas Bride would have first seen. When he arrived, the finishing touches would have just been put to the south wing here, you can see, which was completed in 1859. And the central part of the library with these top-hatted gentlemen at the door, that's the original part of the library from 1856. And then when he was a teenager, he might have come in to study at the library when the whole library was complete. The whole of Queen's Hall was complete, with the North Wing having been completed in 1864. And if you're particularly eagle-eyed, you might have noticed our two lions here guarding the entrance. So they were there up until about 1924. They then went off to a fairly appropriate place for lions. They went to Melbourne Zoo. But at some stage in the 1960s, they disappeared. So we're hopeful they escaped from the zoo, but we think they probably got thrown out in a big clean-up in the 1960s. And this is the Melbourne that Thomas Bride would have walked along these streets to get to work in 1881. This is Melbourne in 1881, a fantastic photograph. And it's interesting that both the library and the exhibition buildings are the two dominant buildings. So the library really looks very impressive there on the Melbourne skyline. And this is a bit of a close-up of the library, and the portico there really makes it a very grand building, but also a less austere building than it was before that. And also I do like the iron gates and the iron fence there. And that's the library after Thomas Bride would have retired. So obviously with the Grand Dome built in 1913, and you'll see our founder, Redmond Barry there on the steps, still being guarded by the lions. And one of the interesting things is that if Thomas Bride was to walk into the library today, it actually would seem fairly familiar to him, because all of the buildings that are publicly available, apart from a couple of the courtyards, were all there during Thomas Bride's lifetime. And most of them were there during the time he was the Chief Librarian. Some were parts of the museum and some parts of the gallery, but he would be familiar with virtually all of the public areas of the library. Now, that's not Thomas Bride at the inquiry counter, but this is taken around about the time that Thomas Bride was the Chief Librarian at the library. And the library is looking very beautiful there. And many of you hopefully have had the chance to come in and see the restored Queen's Hall, restored through greatly through the generosity of the Ian Potter Foundation. And if you haven't had a chance to come in, and it was closed for a fair bit of last year, come and have a look, because you really feel like you are stepping back into the library as Thomas Bride would have known it. And when he took over in 1891, the library was a very fine institution, but it hadn't been particularly well organised. Basically, the retrieval of books was dependent on the memory of the staff. And in 1856, there was 3,500 volumes. And by the time Dr. Bride got there, there was over 100,000 volumes. So that would require a pretty good memory to work out where everything was. So he introduced a classification system, which was called fixed location. So there was an identification of where the book was, what shelf it was on, so it made much easier to retrieve. He also established a card catalogue, which was used by staff from 1881 and then became public in 1891. He provided a lot of training for staff, and he employed a number of Melbourne University students who were part-time at the library. Some went on to pretty significant library careers, and others went on to other outstanding careers in various professions. And also he was very keen on establishing a lending aspect to the library, and he worked very hard on that, found it hard to get funding for that. But in 1892, he was able to establish a lending library at the State Library, or the Melbourne Public Library as it was known then. And that continued up to 1971. But the challenges of a chief librarian are many and varied. And one of the challenges that Thomas Bride faced was that the very fine Lewis and Woody soap kept disappearing from the men's toilets. So this occurred mainly in 1887. He decided to do something about this. And so he got one of his best attendants, Alfred Barber, and he and Alfred came up with a plan that Alfred would be a little bit of an undercover detective and place himself fairly discreetly in the vicinity of the toilets and the wash basin. And no sooner did he take up his position than he managed to grab a young man named Thomas Gleave, who had pocketed the soap. He was duly taken before a magistrate who was definitely not amused and told him that he'd like to make him eat the soap, but instead he gave him 3 days jail. So the soap was replaced, and within about 10 minutes, somebody else tried to steal it. That was a chap called Dudley Lovett, was the second thief. And again, he was nabbed, the soap went back, and then Joseph Collins tried his luck, but Alfred Barber again caught him. So they got sentences of 7 days and 14 days. So the magistrate looked like he was doubling the sentence each time. So you wouldn't want to have stolen it too many more times. I think if you were the 10th person to steal it, if you kept doubling the sentences, you'd be in jail for about 3 years. But it didn't get to that. In fact, Thomas Bride had fixed the issue, so much so that Melbourne Punch gave him a caricature and also gave him a poem. And that was probably a little bit of a badge of honour. It was probably something you'd be quite proud of to be parodied in Melbourne Punch. And you'll see the first few lines of that poem. Bride, LLD of Melbourne, by all his volumes swore that his classic institution should lose its soap no more. So he did manage to achieve that. Okay, so let's head off to the Antarctic. And well might you ask how we headed off there, but it's really because Dr. Bride and a number of other gentlemen in Melbourne in the 1880s did play a significant role in reviving the exploration of the Antarctic. So up to that point, there'd been some amazing explorations. James Cook had circumnavigated the Antarctic in 1772 to 1775, as did Fatty I. Bellingshausen, 1819 to 1821, a Russian expedition. They were both able to surmise the continental nature of the Antarctic and the forbidding nature of the Antarctic, but they didn't actually sight land. Then there followed 3 national expeditions, the French one under Dumont d'Urville, Charles Wilkes, an American expedition, and then James Clark Ross led a British expedition, all in the Antarctic at roughly the same time, the late 1830s, early 1840s. they were able to sight the Antarctic. They mapped various parts of the coast, but they didn't actually ever make a landing. James Clark Ross managed to penetrate the sea that now bears his name, Ross Sea, and took his ships further south than anybody had ever been. And you see his two ships there, Terror and Erebus, and the two volcanic mountains named for them behind there. So what happened next? Well, pretty much nothing. No one went back to the Ross Sea for 50 years. And in 1883, Thomas Bride was chairing a meeting, and Thomas Bride was a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in London, so he had a great interest in geography. And he was chairing a meeting to decide whether Victoria would create its own geographical society. And the vote was locked at 4-4, and he cast his vote to create a geographical society, and that did have quite important implications. The Geographical Society got off to work very quickly, but not only were they concerned with the geography of Australia, which you would think would be a fair enough challenge in itself, but they decided they would investigate the geography of the Antarctic as well. And if you can see there, you'll see Dr. Bride's name on this Antarctic Exploration Committee, which was established out of the Geographical Society and the Royal Society, and various other notables of the colony. And they acted fairly quickly and very enthusiastically to try and revive interest in exploration of the Antarctic. They had the ear of the Premier. Unfortunately, not the finances of the Premier, though. He was happy to help them in certain ways, but they always came up against a problem with funding. The Victorian Agent General in London acted on their behalf. And what they were doing was something that was recognised around the world, to the point where this heroic chap here, Adolf Nordenskjöld, heard about it all the way up in Sweden. So Adolf Nordenskjöld was a world famous explorer at that time. He's not very famous now, but he had conquered the Northeast Passage, which is the passage across the Arctic Ocean between the Atlantic and the Pacific on the Siberian side of the Arctic. So a pretty amazing expedition. And he made an offer to actually lead an expedition to the Antarctic, taking Victorian scientists that would be jointly funded by Sweden and Australia. He managed to raise the funds. In Australia, the funds weren't forthcoming, so unfortunately that didn't go ahead. And that opened the way for another chap named Henrik Bull, who was a Norwegian living in Melbourne, and he was associated with the Antarctic Exploration Committee. And he managed to get funding in Norway in 1893 to lead an expedition, and he came to Melbourne and he was willing to take scientists with him to the Antarctic. But the Victorian scientists who were nominated took one look at the pretty rough looking whaling vessel and the even rougher looking crew and decided that they wouldn't go. And that opened the way for this gentleman here. This is a chap called Carsten Borchgrevink, who was another Norwegian living in Australia. He raced to Melbourne and claimed some sort of scientific qualifications. He really didn't have any, but they took him as a general hand who could do science in whatever spare time he might have had. So they set off to the Antarctic, mainly searching for whales, and you'll be happy to know that they weren't that successful at that. They caught one single whale, but on a much quieter day than you can see there, they got close enough to the Antarctic continent to take a whaleboat and to row to shore and to set foot on the rocky beach at Cape Adare, which is adjacent to the Ross Sea, thereby becoming the first people to make a confirmed landing on the Antarctic mainland. So they returned to Melbourne. They weren't feeling too happy about things because if you're on a whaling expedition, everybody got a percentage of the profits. And there were definitely no profits with this one. But they found themselves the centre of enormous congratulations. The Antarctic Exploration Committee held various receptions for them. Henrik Bull was invited to write articles for the newspaper. And Carsten Borchgrevink saw this as a great opportunity. In 1895, there was a major geographical congress in London, and that was attended by the greatest scientific and geographic minds and the greatest explorers of the age. He raced off to London. He arrived after the congress had commenced. He insisted on delivering a paper, and he was a very insistent gentleman. But what he had to say was fairly meagre, really. He said he found a bit of moss on an island off the Antarctic, and he was one of 8 people that set foot on the beach at Cape Adare. Well, that was greeted with enormous enthusiasm by some of the greatest explorers and greatest scientists of that time, who all queued up to congratulate him on his achievement. And on the basis of that, he got private funding to lead the first expedition to spend the winter in on the Antarctic continent. They left in 1898, spent 1899 at Cape Adare, and then returned in January 1900, and thereby paving the way for the future expeditions to the Antarctic. So I think you could draw a line. It might be a little bit squiggly and a little bit faint, but you could draw a line from Thomas Bride creating the Geographical Society and being involved in the Antarctic Exploration Committee to the opening up of that exploration of the Antarctic continent. Okay, so the 1890s was actually a particularly sad time for Thomas Bride with his family. He suffered quite a range of family tragedies. Firstly, in 1891, both his father, who was quite elderly, but also his sister, succumbed to the world Russian flu pandemic. We're pretty used to pandemics now. Well, there was one from 1889 to 1891, killed about 1 million people around the world and got to Australia in late winter 1891. And both Thomas Bride's father and sister succumbed on exactly the same day. But much worse was to come. In 1895, Thomas Bride's wife, who was quite a bit younger than him and had bore him 5 children, she went in for a minor operation and died under the anaesthetic before the operation had commenced. In 1898, he remarried. Within a month of that, 2 of his young children, a son and a daughter aged 3 and 5, had contracted scarlet fever, and both died again on the same day. You'd think he'd used up all his bad luck by that stage, but unfortunately not, because in 1900, his daughter at 10 years of age died of diphtheria. So of his 5 children, only 2 survived him. And look, those sort of tragedies were unfortunately very common in the 19th century, and most families were touched by infant or childhood mortality, but I think poor Thomas Bride endured more bad luck than most. He retired in 1909, but he didn't retire from public life. He threw himself into various causes. And one of the ones that he was involved in were the conscription debates around the referendums in 1916 and 1917. Most of you will be familiar with those. It was a very divisive issue, and he was a Conservative by nature. He, in 1880, had run for the Conservative Party and been narrowly defeated. And he was part of the Referendum Council and part of the movement to promote the yes vote to introduce conscription. And whether we agree with that or not, the fact is he had the courage of his convictions, and he was willing to go to public meetings, very volatile public meetings, and try to speak quite reasonably to present his point of view, often being shouted down. Ultimately, the 1916 referendum was very narrowly defeated, and the 1971 more substantially defeated. He was also in retirement on the council of the Melbourne University and also RMIT, what is now RMIT, what was then the Working Men's College. You'll see him there closest to the camera on the far right. That's the council of the Working Men's College. He was also on the board of the Royal Melbourne Hospital as well. But his sort of final action, public action, was with this fairly curious political movement that really took flight after the war in Australia, called Initiative Referendum and Recall. It was based on sort of direct democracy from the Swiss cantons in the 16th century that was taken up with great zeal in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And they have that legislation in the states still in a number of the states. And what it means is that it's an idea of direct democracy. So any citizen can initiate, that's the initiative, initiate a piece of legislation, or choose to promote the repeal of a piece of legislation, that's the referendum part, or recall a public official. Not so important in Australia because we don't elect public officials, we only elect parliamentarians, so government officials aren't elected, but that's quite a big thing in the United States. So, and in order to do that, once you've actually decided you want to introduce a piece of legislation, you have to get a prescribed number of signatures, and that would promote a vote on that. So I'm not sure how workable it would be, but it was strongly promoted in the 1920s, and it was partly as a result of the First World War, this idea that if all the combatants had have had that sort of direct democracy, perhaps the war wouldn't have occurred. It tends to raise its head a little bit, usually in times of crisis. It appeared again in the 1930s, but ultimately it didn't really go much further than being an idea, and being an idea that had quite a bit of interest during that time, but ultimately it wasn't picked up, or it didn't become part of legislation, or the Constitution wasn't changed to incorporate that. So Thomas Bride passed away in 1927, so age 78, and I think we'd all agree that he made a really significant contribution to our library and to librarianship in general, but he also made a great contribution to the Victorian community through his involvement with political issues, quite a reasonable involvement, through his involvement with education through the councils of Melbourne Uni and the Working Men's College, or RMIT, and through his involvement with geographical pursuits. So I think we'd all agree that he does very much deserve to have a building named for him, and he does have a building named for him. So on that note, I'll pass back to Liz.
Excellent. Thank you, David. There are questions, but as I said, we'll save them to the end and hear what David has to say. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Liz. I'll just share my screen. Excellent. Okay, many of you will be familiar with the World War I honour board that hangs beside the entrance to the La Trobe reading room. A couple of years ago, I wrote 2 blog posts about honorees on that board. One was published on the website and one was not. This is the one that was, this presentation is based on the one that was not. The published one was about a museum employee named Percy Trowell, and a chemist by trade. He was the quintessential Anzac hero. He's a wonderful leader, won the DSO as a recipient for bravery in action, and tragically was killed 6 weeks before the armistice. The battalion history summed up Trowell as, Trowell and Ashmead were natural leaders of men, and it was the natural leader who so often paid with his life in the time of crisis. Such men would have been of inestimable value to Australia in the troublesome days that followed the end of the war. Grand words indeed. Private Daral Alwyn Robert Wright's career did not follow those lines. And it is his European tour that we're going to look at today. We'll call him Wrighty or Wright, mainly because he called himself at various times Daral Alwyn Robert Wright, Robert Albert Wright, Daniel Robert Albert Wright, and David Alwyn Robert Wright. His AIF service record, if that's anything to go by, Daral Wright does not fit the librarian stereotype, nor, it would seem, that of a public servant in the post-war public library. Wright began at the library on the 7th of November 1912 as a junior attendant, and he had charge of the lending library delivery counter. This isn't Wrighty, as the photo was taken in 1910, 2 years before he started. But the fact that he would have been on the other side of a cage may have been prescient given his ensuing career. Originally enlisting under his own name, Daral Alwyn Robert Wright, he was allocated regimental number 2056 and allotted to the 5th Reinforcements of the 7th Battalion. Now, strangely, there is no further record of him until he reappears, re-enlisting under the name Robert Albert Wright, number 2137 in the 59th Battalion, 7 months after his original enlistment. Undergoing initial training at Broadmeadows, like most soldiers did at the day, Wright suffered his first bout of venereal disease and spent March to May 1916 at Langwarrin Camp, the hospital which had been set aside to deal with such cases, and it was very well used. Just before entering the hospital, he had married his deceased brother's widow, Isabel Wright, but they had little time before he boarded the Orsova in August, and then at the end of the voyage disembarked at Plymouth on the 14th of September 1916. Within a month of arriving in England, Wright was facing his first disciplinary charges: assaulting a soldier, drunk and disorderly, using obscene language to a military policeman. And this resulted in 14 days field punishment number 1. Now, field punishment number 1 was being tied to a fixed object, often a fence or a wagon wheel, for no more than 2 hours a day, and heavy labour for the rest of the sentence. Not satisfied, this was immediately followed by a further 28 days field punishment number 2, which was the result of more obscene language, being absent without leave for 4 days, while still under the original sentence, mind you, and the forfeiture of 47 days' pay. A further charge of neglecting to obey an order of an NCO was added in November. And for field punishment number 2, was the same as field punishment number 1, just without the labour. Upon proceeding to France, he joined the battalion in early December. Wright arrived at Etaples like many, many other Australian soldiers, but almost immediately he was hospitalised with a serious skin infection. After being discharged on the 4th of April 1917, Wright was charged with being drunk in the town of Boulogne on the 7th of April, resulting in more field punishment. Finally, about to join his battalion on the 16th of April, that same day he was admitted to the 51st General Field Hospital, which specialised in venereal disease, with a case of gonorrhoea that kept him there until the end of July. Upon leaving the hospital, he immediately went AWOL, absent without leave, and was apprehended 10 days later near Le Havre. And you can see that's a fair way to go before recapture or before being picked up. Whereupon he was again hospitalised for VD for a further 2 months. And certainly the hospitals of the day were beautiful residences. I don't know that you particularly want to stay in one though. Eventually, upon discharge from the hospital, he began the march with the other dischargees to join their unit. That was on the 1st of November 1917. But somewhere along the way, he absented himself from the parties of dischargees and was apprehended a month later at Calais. I can't work out how you walk through a war zone and get that far. Remarkable. The army had had enough, and Wright was court-martialed for desertion and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labour in January 1918. However, health intervened and another venereal hospital stint ensued, this time at Rouen. That suspended the sentence, but while he was in the hospital, he went AWOL yet again. This time saw him at large for another month before being apprehended, this time at La Courtellerie. Another 90 days was added to the original 2-year sentence, and Wright entered number 1 military prison at Rouen in June 1918. And some drawings here done by prisoners. In September, so he'd been in the prison for 4 months, he escaped from a working party and was recaptured 2 months later, 8 days before the armistice, and then returned to hospital in Le Havre, where he stayed again until March 1919, before again returning to prison. With the war over for 7 months, Wright left France under escort for His Majesty's Prison, Shepton Mallet, Somerset, in June 1919. And then, from there, he went on to Lewes Detention Barracks to await repatriation to Australia. In August, it was decided that the unserved portion of his sentence would be remitted as soon as he got on the ship to get the Karanga to return to Australia. Despite this magnanimous and I guess you could almost unmilitary, taking a view to discharging the sentence, Wright managed more trouble. When the Karanga stopped in Durban, South Africa, Wright disembarked and, possibly short of cash, accosted a number of civilians on the wharf demanding money with the threats of assault. They took him back on board the ship, got him home to Australia, and finally Wright was discharged from the AIF on the 11th of December 1919. When you do the maths, during his 4.5 years in the RAF, Wright spent just over 3 years in hospital, AWOL, or in a military prison, and didn't get within cooee of the enemy. 3 months later, after his discharge, his marriage also came to an end. Isabel petitioned to have their marriage declared null and void. She had left him soon after his return because of, and in the paperwork it notes, his drunken condition, and because he informed her that he had misconducted himself with other women. The petition was granted, and this freed Wright up. And in 1921, he married Violet McWaters, and they remained together until he passed away on the 9th of July, 1949. As for the library, Wright applied to return to his junior attendant's job less than 2 weeks after his discharge. However, as prudent managers, before making his decision about him being re-employed, the library asked for a copy of his service record from the AIF. And the AIF sent it. They didn't send the medical details, but they did send his full record. And I imagine that the list of charges and punishments would have made for some alarming reading around the board table when they were deciding whether to re-employ Wright or not. Unsurprisingly, Wright was not listed as a public servant after 1919. His electoral roll entry listed under David Alwyn Robert Wright indicates professions of last maker and salesman. So there you have it, a very different military career from Percy Trowell. And I sometimes wonder what would Percy have made of his fellow soldier had he survived the war, or had Daral actually served under him. So there we go. Righty, good on you.
Excellent. And thank you, David. And thanks to both David and Andrew for absolutely fascinating presentations. I think it's really interesting to reflect on the differences in the people's lives, or those people who are connected with the library. And obviously we have two very different characters presented today. I'm going to start the questions with some for David, just with that thought in mind, in a way. Is there any way to find information or understand why Wrighty joined the library in the first instance?
I don't think so. I don't know that employment records of the day, they may very well exist, perhaps at the Public Record Office of Victoria. I don't know that they're within the actual library collection, those sorts of things. The information about when he joined was from the public service, the public list of public officers, which is it's an excellent resource, particularly for family history, because it gives when they joined, what their pay was, how long they'd been in that role. But not exactly why, no. No, it does seem like an interesting choice.
It's not a natural fit to my mind, but maybe.
Maybe the library turned him into that.
Well, indeed.
Who knows?
Excellent. And just some other questions connected to that case. So were soldiers executed for desertion during World War I?
Not in the AIF, no. They couldn't do that. That was legislated. They certainly could in the British Army. And in fact, I'm 99% sure every other British, like the Canadians, executed for desertion and cowardice. But it was legislated that you couldn't do that in the AIF.
He was probably lucky. Yeah. So how did he end up dying?
Yes, I did look. I did get a copy of. I invested $20 and got a copy of his death certificate. Multiple sclerosis. Although back in those days, it was disseminated sclerosis, but now we call it multiple sclerosis. So, yes, but nothing related to. Well, I'm not a doctor, but not directly related anyway to his earlier experiences.
And a final question about Wrighty. So what brought him to your attention? So how did you, because obviously you've gone down this rabbit hole of finding out all this information. Why?
Well, Carmen Quick and I just looked at the honour board and we thought it would be really great to firstly identify exactly who they were and get a bit more information about them, like their first names, etc. And then we just divided them in half. And we looked at each of them, and I just happened to get 2 of these in my lot. And his service record has so much red ink on it. You just start reading it. That was all. Yeah. And then from that leads you out to other public records. So I did Percy first. So the contrast between the 2 of them was too good to miss.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on to him. So, Andrew, do we know why Thomas Bride found it hard to find funding for a public lending library?
I think there's probably a couple of things. I think when Redmond Barry died in 1880, just before Thomas Bride commenced, there was a bit of a battle between the Library Council, which had been, run very strongly by Redmond Barry, and the government. So the government was sort of asserting itself. So there were battles around the library at that time, so that probably affected funding. I think the other things were that it required an additional space, so it wasn't just going to be operating out of the existing spaces. They needed a new place for it, and plus a stock for it, and probably also that Melbourne had boomed during the 1880s and boomed too hard, and then it crashed very hard in the early 1890s, so there would have been less funding around for anything really, but certainly it did have to work pretty hard in order to establish a lending library.
Yep, that makes sense, absolutely. So we've got people who are interested to know, is there a way you could find out what happened to their forecourt lions if you wanted to be absolutely sure whether or not the zoo threw them out?
Well, I think we're pretty sure. I think it took us a fair bit of time to actually work out that they had disappeared. I think there has been a bit of research done about them, and it's a great pity they ever left, actually. But although they would be a bit of a hazard now with Redmond Barry and the 2 lions, it'd be hard to get up the stairs. But yeah, look, I think staff have done research on that, and and we've checked with the Melbourne Zoo, and they don't have them anymore. And they did have a big clear out in the 1960s. So unless they've escaped to the wild, we're pretty sure they've disappeared to a tip somewhere, never to be seen again, unfortunately.
Well, it's sad. Fortunately, we're not going to end on that note. So that's good. And this is going back to the presentation. So why did the major powers lose interest in exploring the Antarctic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a couple of reasons. I think primarily it was because it was very remote. It was very hostile. They'd seen enough to realise there was no sort of economic or strategic advantage. And it presented a pretty serious challenge to the public purse and also to safety. I think for a number of countries, Russia had its own Arctic, polar regions that were part of its country, so there wasn't a great incentive. The French had really explored the Pacific quite extensively, and also there was, various political issues in France in the 1840s. In America, the American expedition by Charles Wilkes was an amazing expedition, but it was a very fractious one, and it ended in quite a few court-martials and counter-court-martials. So that really undermined their appetite for further exploration. I think with the British, it was partly that immediately after that famous expedition by James Clark Ross, the 2 ships, the Terror and Erebus, were used in the famous attempt by John Franklin to solve the problem of the Northwest Passage. And those 2 ships and all his crew disappeared, and all the men died, and the British spent an absolute fortune trying to find any sign of that expedition in the Arctic, and so that sort of undermined their wish to pursue further Arctic or Antarctic adventures. And then in the 1850s, the Crimean War occurred. So there was those sort of reasons, I think, that really stifled that sort of exploration and halted the sort of interest in it in the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely. So some questions related to the library itself. So when did the library stop being a lending library, and why?
1971, it stopped being a lending library. I think that partly it was due to the fact that the public library network was so strong. particularly post-war, the public library network built up enormously. When we didn't have a public library in the city until the Melbourne City Library opened probably about 20 years ago, I guess, when I'm still a member of the Athenaeum Library. So there was a private library in the city. But I think it was generally that the public library network, and not many people lived in the city and people used public libraries a lot, so that the emphasis on lending was with the public libraries rather than with the state library, which became very much about, retaining the collection rather than necessarily having a lending collection, which is an additional expense because you need, multiple copies of books, etc., and you need a much different type of collection to establish a public lending collection.
Makes sense. Excellent. And I think we'll leave it on that note. So I just want to thank everyone for coming along today. I want to once again thank Andrew and David for a really interesting and also entertaining insight into two of the people connected with the library. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, the library has now completely reopened, and you no longer need to make bookings to come in. It's simply a matter of registering using a QR code when you enter. So I hope we'll see all of you in the library again soon. So thanks so much for attending today and also for your ongoing support of the library as a friend of the library. So thanks so much.